Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast. My name is Peter Pascucci, and I'm here with my co-host, Ava Benjamin Shore. Today, we are thrilled to have an incredible guest we've been eager to chat with since the beginning of the show, the incredibly talented cinematographer Kira Kelly, ASC. Kira is known for her work on projects like the feature documentary 13th, directed by Ava DuVernay, the Netflix series Self-Made, starring Octavia Spencer and directed by Casey Lemons and Duane Davis, the FX series Why the Last Man, and most recently the Hulu miniseries Ekko, directed by Sydney Freeland. She has received 2 Primetime Emmy nominations for her work on Insecure and 13th. Kira, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hey, Kira, I'm really excited to talk to you today. There's so many things I'm looking forward to exploring together. One thing I'm really curious to hear more about, and that's your experience of starting out in the lighting department. To this day, it still can be hard to come by a woman in lighting and grip. And I imagine when you started out, it was just as difficult, if not more so. Can you share with us what it was like cutting your teeth in that department, and where geographically did you get your start?
So I started off in New York. I went back home after college, and I knew that I wanted to work in the lighting department because I think, camera department kind of, although like I had studied being a cinematographer and all that stuff, lighting was where I found my, it was just more fun. It was where I found joy. So I started off as a PA, and I just badgered every gaffer that I worked with. I started off in non-union work in New York, and so I was able to say every gaffer I worked with, I'll work for free, blah, 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 what shoots you have coming up. And I think I just got completely blessed in the time and the location that I started off in, because in New York at that time, especially in the non-union world, there were not only a lot of women working in the electric department, there were so many Black and brown folks that were in the non-union world that we were all just kind of coming up together. And honestly, it wasn't until I got to LA where I looked around and was like, whoa, there's either no women here or everybody's white. It was very strange. I think maybe if I had been in the union in New York, maybe it would have probably been a different story, but there was some sort of beautiful stuff that was happening in the non-union world in the early aughts that embraced me, and I really found my way, and I got to learn so much. And I really it was one of those things where working as an electrician, I used to love to be the on-set electric because it was on a day on set, if you're not on set and actually doing stuff, the time moves incredibly slow. You know what I mean? So if I wasn't I used to always just love to be the one right by the gaffer, the one and also just because I was learning, obviously, like I said, I was, I'd gone to film school, and lighting was just something that I found so fun and so interesting. And every day on set, I was really in this position where my rent job was such a great education. And I was really intentional about it, and very much of just trying to absorb as much as possible. And at that time, I was shooting as much as I could, which, at that point was mainly documentaries, because I think also during that era, documentary was the one place where women were acceptable as DPs. It wasn't we couldn't shoot all these other things, but yeah, docs, sure, have at it, ladies. It was this very much world, which I loved. It was still I learned so much in my documentary world to this day of how to do everything on your own, or how to make a location work for 5 hours at a time, and all this stuff. So I was able to shoot, but then also take the stuff I learned from my rent job as an electric and really further it all.
It makes so much sense what you're saying about how it was work and it was to pay the bills, but it also was such a valuable education, which I think is such an interesting way to look at it. I think to have that foresight at the time to be this is going to be the foundation for, what I end up doing as a cinematographer is really cool.
And what I think is also such a vital thing that I learned during that time, not just about lighting, but actually how to be on set. I feel set, for lack of a better term, hierarchy is a thing. And not I'm your boss, you better listen to me. It's just no, just kind of how a set moves and like the ebb and flow of set of like, when is the time for this one thing to come in? When do you kind of need to step away and give some space? And there's so many unspoken things about how a set actually moves and how a productive set moves that I think that is like, should be a class in and of itself. It was like just training people to have good set ears and good set, just know-how of like knowing when, I always tell like when people are always, I come across it a lot, like for example, people who are in camera department but interested in learning about lighting. And then my first thing is like always just like, if you're a second and you're working in the camera department but you want to know more about lighting, talk to the key grip, talk to the gaffer, but then also know when, like you have to like
Yes.
know when to just be like, okay, I really like you just did something over there that was so cool. Can I ask you about that? Or people, I find that especially imagine like, we do our jobs like, it's this everyday thing of like, if somebody's like, that was so cool. And you're like, wait, what was cool about it? People do want to talk about it. But yeah, I think that like the how a set moves. And I think that's something that a lot of DPs coming up, whether or not you go straight from school, if you're lucky enough to go right into DPing or right into directing or something, I think there is something to learn about actually crewing. And I think it does actually make you, when you actually crew, it does give you more of a respect for the crew that you're now working with, the crew that you're now running. I think if you have like an experience of dragging cable through New York City gutters at 3 a.m., you probably have a little bit more of an appreciation for what they're going through. And like, just like not to say that they still won't drag the cable through, but at least there's like an appreciation and like a thought. And yeah, I feel like crewing is a good thing for all of us to learn somehow.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like on some level, the DP is, you're the boss of Genie and camera, but you're also a little bit of the insulation from directors, producers, production that may want to push a crew maybe more than you think is worth it, or you have to at least weigh the pros and cons, because I think that even making sure the morale, stays high is a valuable element of just a set environment. It's not good if everyone is unhappy and wants to leave, but you're making them do something, and it is an important thing, I think, when I feel like there is a difference when people have that experience as a crew member, and then graduate to become a boss, Yeah.
It also kind of reminded me of something you mentioned, like, I guess fast forwarding now to like running the set, like you describing the way that the set moves and stuff. I heard you talk about how in terms of that hierarchy and that power dynamic, it can be tough to like get people on your side when you're maybe not the person that they expect to be in that role. And like the way that you described it was you were like, by lunch, I usually know like if I've been able to run this or not. And otherwise, like maybe at that point you need to like talk to your keys or something about it. But can you talk just a little bit about that experience of navigating that and kind of learning ways to sort of run the set your own way?
I mean, it's not even when I was starting out, it still happens today, but it's like one of those things where, I think that people are more used to seeing women DPs, although I still have this uncomfortable amount of times when people are like, I've never worked with a woman DP before. I'm just like, I don't know how, but I feel like we're out and about. And I feel like it's like, also on top of that, being a Black woman DP, I find more often than not, there's questions and I can feel the questions and I'm just like, oh, does she know what she's doing? Does she not? How did she end up getting a job? Does she know what she wants and all this stuff? And I found that a lot of times I just have to, in my own mind, just like, you know what, this is just like any other thing. I walk in, I find that like, the crews that know me, like, like crews in New York or LA or like ones that I visited before, like, it's always like, I think it always happens like when I'm traveling, like if I go, like it's like a commercial somewhere else, or if I'm starting a new job, of just like, listen, I really do appreciate the camaraderie of our job. I really do appreciate the, like, having everybody be able to bring opinions and things like that. But there is something I found that like, there is this by lunchtime thing. I always I don't let it get in my head, like before lunch, even the scout day. I'm just like, hey, like you could feel the questions. Well, why don't you want to do it like this? I'm like, oh, it's actually a great idea, but let's try this direction first. Or maybe you should do this. I'm like, also valid idea, but I think this might be the one that we should go with. And so I usually just give folks until lunch where I'm just like, listen, I really do know what I want in this situation. And although that doesn't mean the fact that I never am open to ideas, like we're here to collaborate. But I definitely have felt that usually by lunch, usually by the time you kind of get through a couple setups, people are like, oh, okay, yeah. But she does know what she's asking for. She does know what she ends up wanting. And I feel like for me in the beginning, when I started just shooting and I was only shooting, I think that weighed on me and I let it get into my head a little bit too much of like, well, why are they second guessing? Or maybe there's a reason I was second guessing, or maybe I wasn't confident enough. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. And I really, at this point, I'm just like, I can't. I really just have to let it be. And I let people be as much of a part of it as they'd like to be. And I think that that's the best part of what we do. Like, for example, like when I go on a tech scout, whether or not it's a gaffer and key grip that I've worked with for like 3 years straight, or it's somebody totally new, I will go to a tech scout and just be like, this is the light I'd like outside. This is the quality I'd like. We should use, an 18K Fresnel. We should, have this sort of color and all this stuff. But at the same time, as soon as I say those things, I'm very quick to be like, but what do you think? As far as like, is this efficient with how many people we've got? Is this efficient with how much money we've got? Knowing that this is what I would like, I'm always very open to like, how do we make it work time-wise? How do we make it come in on budget? And most people, I feel like, I don't know, I think that people like that sort of thing. I think that, again, this comes back to being a part of a crew. Like crew members have so much information, like, gaffers, key grips, the operators, ACs, like they work, hopefully, all the time or work a lot, And so they work with a lot of different DPs. They know a lot of different techniques. They know all this stuff. And so I think it's like always such a mistake to go in and be like, this is the only way and this is my way, I'm going to do it. But I do think you definitely need that beginning. You need the beginning of like, this is what I want. How can we make it work within the bag we've got?
I'm really glad that we covered some of these aspects about your working style first. And I can really see how your experience coming up plays into some of the work you've done. Like, I think one of the most recent projects you did, Ekko, which is a Marvel TV show, is an action superhero genre TV show that I think also looks really good, which was, as a DP and as someone who doesn't like typically those types of things, it was really nice to watch that. And I think one sequence in particular from Ekko that really stuck out to me is the fight sequence in the first scene. There was something about it that was very visceral. And the way that you and director Sydney Freeland were able to move the camera in and out of the protagonist's senses and in and out of their POV, I thought was so interesting and seamless. I was like watching it thinking, oh, maybe I do like action movies. Like, this is so cool. Like I want more of this. So I was wondering if you could maybe get into a little bit more how you and Sydney staged that scene, how you talked about it and planned it. Because I think for someone like me, who's maybe not super familiar with action, I'd be really curious to know more about it.
Yeah. So that fight sequence and then Ekko in general was such a, I don't know, it's all Sydney. Like she really took, like Sydney loves action and was very much from the beginning, like, how do we really make this fight scene? But I think for Sydney, it was never about, and it shouldn't be about, like, let's just have a cool fight scene to have a cool fight scene. It was never, ever once that. It was always so much from prep, from the beginning. Like, she knew that she wanted to do a oneer, and she knew that she wanted it to mean something. Like, this is character development. When we start, we have Ekko, she's gone through some stuff. She's wounded in a way, but she's still like an awkward, rebellious teenager. When she comes out the other end of those 5 minutes, she's a killer. You know what I mean? And wants more. And so for Sydney, the purpose of this fight scene is to have this character become a villain, basically. And so that was something that, she worked with me and like our stunt coordinator, Mark, about like, no matter how cool the fighting has to be, it has to be about the moment where she crosses over. And really, like, that moment is when we push into her and she's struggling and you like, this is so cool, like what they did with the sound design of like having the heartbeats off, they're not sunk, and then two heartbeats get sunk together. She's killing this person and then it becomes one heartbeat and we push into her face, and it's like, that's it. She's like, and now she can take on Daredevil, and now it's like this whole thing. And so from the very beginning, Sydney is very much about story and what it means. And as a DP, that's just like, it's amazing. It's like what we do, like how can we show it? And so she wanted to do this oneer, and so we ended up watching like all these really great oneers, like the legendary one from Atomic Blonde, and like all these different fight scenes, but always keeping in our head the fact that the story is important. So this was a big, Ekko was a big deal for me in so many ways, but I would say one of the biggest things was working with second unit. Like I hadn't really, on all my other jobs, if there was action stuff, fighting stuff, and like not, like there were a few, but not, it wasn't anything like, crazy. That was just me. I would do it, and this was the first time where it was like, no, we can't have you do it because like second unit is going to be there. And so what we ended up doing is like we would go and we went and did all the stuff with Alakwa. And then, for other parts where Alakwa was shooting with us on something else, then, her stunt double was doing the fights. And so this was like, for me, it was hard to wrap my head around, but ended up being such a great process because I find that when you have to give it over to somebody and say, this is what I want, it makes you so much more like dialed in. So I had the real great pleasure of working with Nico Aguilar, who's an incredible DP on his own. The fact that he was willing and able and wanting to do second unit with us was amazing. So we would just sit and like, I would show him the lighting plans, like this is how the lighting should be. This is where the camera's going to be moving through. And like, we would work with stunts during rehearsal days of like, figuring out how to place the camera, in the cardboard box worlds and all this stuff. So it was a really great mix of like first unit and second unit working together in a oneer that somehow seamlessly kind of like goes together, which was a really fun technical thing to work out. And it's one of those things where it's like you do have to, and this is for me, it's like I prep, being on set is actually, I would hope is my favorite place to be, but second close is prep, because I feel like this is a place where all the dreams are made, and set is where they all go to die in some way. but like, like sitting there and being able to have really good notes and then having a partner like a second unit DP who's really executing those notes and like making sure that you're getting all the stuff that you need. And Sydney and I were able to be there for most of it, which is great. And I don't know, it was one of those things that was like a really big learning curve of how to, it's just like a different level of executing. Like, like I can execute on set with my gaffer. I'm at Key Grip and I'm right there. But then also having this almost like game of telephone of like making sure like a whole other unit is doing the same thing and like wanting that same sort of feel was really important. But yeah, I would say that, with that, I think something that I took away from that was not only, working with second unit stuff, but also just making sure that like, even if it is this, like, I feel like we're in this, I guess it's not a new thing. It's like, cinema or art or anything in general. There's always this thing like, let's do something cool. Let's have this cool shot. And I'm a sucker for a cool shot. I'm a sucker for all the cool stuff. But ultimately it has to mean something. And I feel like ultimately it has to be something that furthers. And I feel like that's why so many ways of like that Ekko resonated on so many different levels is because of Sydney and Sydney's, determination to make things mean something.
I think it's so interesting in the context of this project because like Ava said, it's like fully based on a graphic novel, and so many Marvel films have set a look for this, but I completely agree with Ava that like the look of the show is totally breathtaking, and everything from the lighting to the lens choices and just the way that you capture Sydney's character feels very like empathetic and very story driven in a beautiful way. But yeah, I was curious, like I heard you talk a little bit about coverage, and I think like as someone who's worked on so many huge television shows and with so many amazing directors, I'm curious, basically what you mentioned, and I thought it was so interesting, was you were saying that sometimes conventional coverage is just shot, reverse shot, reverse shot, and it can feel a little bit void of emotion. And if you were to turn off the audio and you watch it, you might not even really know what's happening emotionally. And I think that that's such a valuable insight for people working on narrative to think about visually, like when you really strip everything away, like visually, how are you capturing something? How are you covering something? So yeah, so as someone who's so experienced at that and worked with so many great directors, I'd be curious just to hear you talk about how you've imbued that sense of emotion into your coverage, or how you've maybe gotten more brave with coverage, and any sort of insights into becoming more confident with some of those choices?
So for me, I was privileged and able to go to film school. And I had this class with this professor named Thomas Gunning. And his focus was on, like, it wasn't like a practical film. It was all like film history, right? And we did like the German Expressionists. He had a class that was only on Fritz Lang. Like, a lot of it was all from the silent era of movies, like, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Metropolis, Dr. Mabuse, like all these films that are these incredible silent films, but like you end up still feeling all of those emotions. And so like they had to figure out a way. Yes, of course, there were the little title cards and everything, but like every shot had to say something. And I think it was like in his class, it's like drilled into like this. I know people say it a lot, but it's just like, it is a visual language, and there are sentences and sentence structure. And I feel like with one of those things, like a challenge that I continue to give myself ever since that first class to like what I do now is like, if somebody were to watch my work on mute, could they tell what the story is? And Ekko was like even more of a different thing because, she is a deaf character and like there was the signing. And so like, how do we like show the emotion too? Aside from the incredible acting that Alakwa did, like how can I, in addition to what the actor is doing, how can I set up a frame or set up a shot that shows what this story is? And for me, like throughout my whole career, and it's something I still like, like I can go home from a scene, it's like, well, I failed that one today. Or I did. I don't know if anybody's going to know. But it is even like something as subtle as like if you're setting up, let's say, two people sitting across from each other in a diner, shot, reverse shot, right? There is a way, although that is challenging, of like, how can you make this something where people can actually see the emotions going on? There are tools as a DP that we have, right? Whether or not it's like picking a time to cross the line, or whether or not it's something where maybe we start off with shoulders, like over the shoulders. I feel like over the shoulders is something that happens so much, and it's like so, but just like it's like one of those things where people are just like, yeah, over the shoulder, we got to show the other person. But then maybe it's something you start over the shoulder, but then you move past and really just make it about the one person talking. And or maybe there's a way of like one character does get over the shoulder because their presence is there the whole time, but when you shoot them, they're clean. There are all these different decisions that can be made within a just standard shot, reverse shot to really center whose story it is. Like if it's something where it's like our protagonist and she's talking to somebody that, who's like, I think this is something where I always like, try to talk to a director beforehand of like through every scene in the script, of like whose scene is it? Like, and just because it's the protagonist, this doesn't mean that it's their scene, And so I really try to figure out just like whose scene it is, whose point of view are we coming from? And then really like, how can you make that clear to an audience that it is their scene? And sometimes it's like, there is a little bit of like a back and forth and maybe they both get a shoulder. Or maybe it's something where you can play with starting off of the eye line and then slowly start moving in. And granted, this is a conversation you should definitely have with the director too, just like playing with this idea. But I do think there are ways, I think that I guess the world where filmmaking becomes this thing of content making and all this stuff where people forget that there is really a lot of power in a frame. There really is a lot of power in composition. And there are a lot of different things subtle things that maybe just you notice, but at least you're kind of like, I guarantee you the audience notices too. Like the audience knows when you have a heavy over the shoulder and you're squeezing somebody out versus, which is not, I'm not saying it's bad, it's just like a way of doing it versus like being very close to somebody. An audience, I feel like it's subtle and they know, and it's something where that those little choices are what pushes the story along. So yeah, I think for each job and each director, it ends up changing, but it is like something that I constantly try to push myself of like, what is this frame saying? It can't just be, okay, here's her bedroom, or here's the office. And I think there's something that there's so much nuance to be able to play with. And I do think that, me, like I think so many other DPs, there was a time where it was just like, it's this fine line that I go between, because I do feel like lens performance, like so many of them do just look the best and the most beautiful, wide open. Like they just like have this fall off and everything's great. But then I started looking at stuff and it's like, shouldn't I have more? This poor production designer and set decorator just spent however long dressing and creating this room, and now I'm just like throwing it all out of focus, which is sometimes super appropriate. But other times it's just like, shouldn't there be a little bit more depth of like actual character? There's so much character that happens in a set. You'd hope, if you're really working with like a great production designer, so much of that character is in that room and is in that space. And so we shouldn't just like automatically throw it out of focus because the bokeh, the lens is cool. Yes, it's a hard pull, but like it does go along with like showing character, showing story, and showing place.
Beautiful.
I would agree with you that, I think the language of cinema is changing a little bit. It's evolving, but I do think that, or at least the things that people are incentivized to do is different maybe now than it was like 20 or 30 years ago. But I still think that the original lessons of film are still the most powerful, and it's like the building of emotion and meaning. It's like that classic Russian filmmaker teacher who had like the 3 images of like the man, the food, and the baby. And depending on the sequence that you put those 3 images in, they create a different meaning and emotion. And I always think about that as like the editing of 3 images and creating an idea or emotion is a greater hit to the mind and the stomach and the intellect than just one good image,
Yeah. And that, I feel like that's so much of our job of like, again, goes back to this, like, this, and I'm guilty of it sometimes too. We were laughing about it earlier of just like one cool shot. But it's just like, there's this thing of like, a movie shouldn't just be a sequence of cool shots. It's like, they're all together. And it's like, I think I forget where it was, but like, I think Deacon said this thing about like, don't spend all your time on the wide shot. Because then I've been guilty of that too. You're just like, oh my gosh, crafting all this stuff. And like, how long are they going to be in that wide shot? Not to say that you shouldn't have a lovely wide shot, but like, I guarantee you I'm going to be pulling that still for longer than they have it in the film, unless it's something where you can get into really, like, I just wrapped a movie and, was able to work with this director named Justin Tipping, who had no regard for, in the best way, for coverage, which is just like, no, we don't need that, or we don't. And it was so reassuring and so nice to be able to play in this world where it's just like, what do we need? What are the things that are necessary to tell this story? And if it's not necessary, we don't need it. And so it was just like, things where then if it's something where you're going to be in that wide shot, then yes, spend your time on it. But if you have to go around and get all the closes and everything, you also have to be responsible for that part of the time too. I think for me, like, there were so many great movies last year, but one scene that continues to stand out in my head is like Maestro, the Bradley Cooper, Maddie Lee Batik movie. There's this scene where they get into a fight and it's like the Thanksgiving Day parade and like Snoopy goes by the window and all this stuff. And it's all in this wide. This is like, I think the biggest fight they have. It's the one that separates them. They never go in. Like, it's really just this wide and you just see these actors head to toe. There's like all this room on top. They're not very big in the frame, but you feel this emotion. You feel this relationship falling apart. And at the end, I think it's like her alone and like Snoopy goes by the window or something. But it's so, the whole time I was watching it, I saw it in the theater and I was just like, when's he going to go in for close? When's he going to go close? And it was like, they're not going in. It was just one of those things that's so exciting. And so that shot told everything you needed to know about that relationship, told you everything you needed to know about that breakup. And I don't know, it was just like, I think that, like you said, Ava, there is this thing of, you can see it. It's just like, okay, wide shot, medium, close, 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 medium, close, 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 wide, and it's over. And it's just like, we know it. And I feel like it's one of those things where as a DP, we can only do so much. We have to get the editors on our sides and the directors and everybody. But it's just like finding ways to be creative in coverage is, I think, such a distinction and will make your work stand out. I think people think, oh, my work will stand out if I've got fancy lighting, or my work will stand out if I use this crazy lens. And yes, those things are true too. But blocking and coverage are so much a part of it, and like really so much of like things to figure out. And I guess it's just basic point of view, like why is the camera here? I think that those are things that I, again, succeed and fail at constantly, but at least try to keep in my head of just like the why.
Yeah.
I love that. Kira, I feel like I heard you allude to something that sounds kind of like maybe a philosophy of yours, but I think what you were saying was that you try to show what's being told instead of saying what it is. Is that a philosophy of yours? Can you just talk a little bit more about that, if it is?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think for us, we play in this world of like smoke and mirrors. It's all a farce in a way, right? We're creating these environments. We're creating this sort of, everything within a shot is put there. And so I guess it comes back to this thing of like, why is it there? If I'm showing the audience this sliver of a door, what is the why there? Should they feel like something is there, or should they feel like there's something welcoming coming? And I feel like we have to be, I think when you get a script and you can respond to a script, it's like, yes, the dialogue is all there. The actor is going to say these things. That is what's going to get the story along, right? But I feel like as a DP, it's my job to tell the story too. And I feel like it's one of those things where we really have to be a part of that by showing it and really making sure that, like, you know, however you do the lighting is great, or maybe there's this technique I want to end up trying and all this stuff, but does it show what this story is? Or is it just because I know, like, okay, this is like how I would light a window in this movie or any other movie or a commercial or something like that? When I find myself going into things that I've done before, not because I'm always trying to change, but I'm just like, okay, why? Is this something that really works because in this moment it's appropriate, or it's just because it's comfortable and I know I can do it quickly? And so I think that that's one of the things that we have to be honest with ourselves about and really think about, of just like, what is it for this movie? What is it for this TV show or this scene that we need to show to get the information across? Sometimes I'm sure I can be annoying to directors in many ways. but I'm like, just like, especially in prep, like this is a glorious time in prep of like I said, trying to talk to them about like whose point of view it's from and why. And I feel like those are always the best conversations that we have with directors, of not like, oh yeah, this day we're going to have the technocrane, we're going to have all this stuff and all this stuff, but like, what are we trying to show with this scene? Where is the character in this scene? What does that mean? And I feel like this is something where I love too. It's like, you know, we get such an awesome opportunity to work with other artists, like a production designer, like the costume designer. And really, like this movie that I just did, the conversations that me, the director, the production designer, and the costume designer had about color alone were just like amazing, like really nerdy, wonderful conversations that ended up elevating the story, because I knew that each of us were like, it's the same thing. You know, I remember for this show I did, Why the Last Man, we had this incredible costume designer named Olga Mills, and I love Olga. And I remember the camera tests, she had showed me in the beginning, like all the stuff she wanted to do and stuff. And I had this heavy LUT, and it was like this LUT of like, I can't even tell you story-wise why it wasn't appropriate story-wise. It was just one of those things that was cool looking. And I remember she showed me, we started looking through the dailies from the test, and she was just like, all the colors are just so different, and it's not what we, you know, it was just more of like creative to creative of like, are we on the same page sort of thing. And I looked and I was like, you're totally right. It was completely not the direction that we had even talked about, or I don't even know if we had actually had a conversation at that point. And so I really like, you know, went back and looked at the LUT and looked at all the stuff and looked at the colors that she had. And then I brought the production designer into it. And the three of us, probably a little late because it was after the camera test, but like had this really great conversation about what colors meant and what we were going to be doing. And so, yeah, I think as a DP, sometimes we get a little bit like, this is what we're doing, and I'm the DP, and we do change. Like the LUT itself can change so much of what other departments are doing. And I think you have to sometimes consider, like, is this just because I want to have this LUT, or are we really all talking about this? We all know how this affects every department. And so ever since then, like well into prep, like I'll show the production designer, costume designer, this is what I'm thinking of. This is the colors I'm thinking of. This is the LUT we're going to be using and all this stuff, so that we can all kind of start from there.
Hi, we are excited to announce our partnership with Laowa Lenses by Venus Optics. Laowa has had a long history of providing cinematographers with unique and state-of-the-art lens options, including their recent Proteus 2x anamorphic series, which remains the most accessible T2.0 option in the market for professional production. A big thank you to SanDisk for helping support our show as well as part of their relentless reliability campaign. The extreme portable solid-state drive has become an essential on film sets and a personal favorite of mine for how durable, reliable, and fast it is. SanDisk leads in drive and memory card technology, emphasizing not just storage, but everything worth keeping. We'd also like to thank our partner at Fujifilm. We're very grateful to them for supporting not just the podcast, but a lot of what we do at the Cinematography Salon. And with the release of their latest camera, GFX 100 II, they release a tool that opens up new creative possibilities. It's brands like these that remind us why we do what we do. It's more than just support, it's about being part of a community that values every shot and every story.
I love hearing about how intentional and thoughtful you are about visual language and composition. It's just such a great reminder of what's important. It's really just making me happy to hear you talk about this. I am personally extremely curious to talk about 13th, the documentary, and kind of in relation to what you've been saying too, because for me, 13th is kind of the gold standard of a visually interesting documentary, especially one that's built around archival and talking heads. Like, I don't think it gets any better than that for me. The locations, the compositions, the subject matter are all just working in tandem in such a way that is like, it's such an important documentary, I think, for a lot of people and for me. And I'm really curious to hear how you and director Ava DuVernay talked about the approach for that project, especially given how thoughtful you are about all the visual language. I'd love to hear you get into that a little more.
Yeah. So when and to this day, 13th is one of my favorite projects. And it's not because of I think, yes, it does have to do with the cinematography and my look of it, but I just also think it's just one of the greatest films, just squarely because of what Ava did. And I feel like it's one of those, I remember when we stopped shooting it, we did our last set of interviews, and I remember asking, okay, so when are we going to do B-roll stuff? And she was like, oh, there's no B-roll. And I was like, okay, sure. Sure, I'll get in, and that's going to be B-roll. And there was none, because she had this really incredible, all this archival footage that was incredible. And then they did all these graphics that were I'm just so impressed with how that movie is so thick with information and statistics and all this stuff. But I feel like you never lose the audience, because people are just it's told in such a visual way. Even the graphics and everything, it's you really, I don't know, you can absorb it all. So basically when that started, that was, I think Ava and I, we had done one day of shooting this VR project that didn't end up happening. And so then she was just I've got this documentary. Would you like to be a part of it? And I was 100%. And at that point, so Hans Charles is the other DP on 13th. And I think that they had already gone out and shot some at the beginning at that point. But the first things that I got were these location photos. We were going to be shooting, I think we were in Oakland that first pass, and these location photos were just amazing. I was looking at these places, wow, how did you find this place? And one of the difficult things about 13th was that we would have to find, in the documentary space of yes, we would have this one location, but we'd have to get 5 different people shooting in this one place, and then 5 different people each with 2 camera directions. So we had a straight on angle, and then we would always have a B camera either off to the side or a 3/4 to the side. And so that was a challenge of walking into the space and being okay, this is the main interview, and then these are some of the side interviews. And I think at that point when we started doing, I think this style of shooting kind of, I'm not sure if it's in fashion anymore. Maybe it is. But at that point afterwards, I kept seeing I remember somebody sent me a lookbook for a documentary. It was half of it was 13th photos. And I was well, I don't know if you know that I shot this, but somehow in the documentary world, and then also in narrative worlds, this look kind of was, people ended up loving it, and I loved it. And I feel for me, it was so much of that was not me pitching to Ava, okay, let's have this, lots of headroom, or let's have this centered frame or off angle. That was all her. And it was really just we would walk like the Angela Davis shot we did of like, in this Oakland train station that was falling apart in this such a beautiful way of like, being stripped down and paint peeling and all this stuff, and sitting her there and then having all this space around her. There was something so regal about that, and like putting her place where, she deserves to be. And like, that was something that was just like, I remember one interview set up, like Ava would be there and be like, tilt up, keep going, or pan right, or just like really trying to, I feel like in documentaries, we get into this talking head interview of like what a talking head should look like. And I feel like as an audience member, audiences kind of know that. They know, okay, sure, this is this dude in his office and this is what they're talking about. And yes, there's maybe a beautiful soft light coming, but there was something about those interviews that were so visually different than you learned what a documentary interview was supposed to look like. I think that's what people really responded to, aside from the incredible subject matter and all that. So that was one of those things. And I feel like with Ava, like it was like, she's just a person who comes across as like so, and she is so secure. Like, she walks in, she knows what she wants and all this stuff. But in those conversations, she always makes you feel like a collaborator. And I feel like that's something where, like, again, we talked about earlier, like trying to strive for with my work of like, listen, I know what I want. I know what I'm looking for, but I'm so open to also ideas about how we can make that better. And I feel like she embodied that of just like, this is what we're doing, this is what I want to look toward this wall, and tilt up more and let's show it. But then what do you think? Is that cool? Or like, it was just kind of like this, like, I feel like there's this way to be confident and like be secure on set that doesn't edge people out. And I feel like that's her. I feel like she's really able to be her and be amazing, but then also bring people into that creative position. And yeah, I think 13th is like one of those things where, it's such a small camera package, we had such a small lighting package, but because we were able to be so bold in the look of it, so bold in the compositions, it really just kind of set it apart.
So fascinating. I certainly have come across that look so many times as well. And like, I totally see how it's absolutely permeated into doc and narrative world. It's for good reason. It's so fascinating to hear that Ava was really behind that.
Yeah. And I think that, with Queen Sugar, the show after that, like, we had some of that same sort of compositions and like those same sort of like really dynamic frames. And yeah, they were both really big for me career-wise. I think that to be able to work with Ava on 13th was huge. And then when she, asked me to I started off on Queen Sugar on the second season, alternating DPs. And that was my first job on a studio show. Like before then I had done this show called East Los High, which was like a Hulu show, which is how I got into the union. But Queen Sugar was the first time, like throughout your career, there's all these like the ceilings, the totally arbitrary things of just like, well, she hasn't done blah, 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 or she's done TV, but she hasn't done a studio TV show, or she hasn't done this, or she hasn't had this budget point and all this stuff. And that one was incredible because it was, Ava's like, this is who I want. And everybody's like, oh, sure. That sounds great. And so that's really, it was a big milestone for me to be able to, do 13th and then also be able to do Queen Sugar and have that be like your first studio show. It suddenly opens up the door to so many other things. And I think that was beautiful what she did with that project, not only for me, but then all the other women directors that she had on that show too. It was pretty amazing.
I'm such a huge fan of Ava's work. Like, I think that she just totally like transcends like with her storytelling and her directing style and everything. And I think pretty much across all the projects. I mean, I remember watching When They See Us and just being jaw dropped by like some of Bradford's work on that. But I'm curious, like now that you are like in this pantheon of like Ava's cinematographers in a way, and I'm curious beyond what you mentioned, which was such a valuable insight about her being able to know what she wants, but towing that line of being open to collaboration. Have there been any other things that you've learned from Ava through your collaborations that you'd be willing to share, whether it's just personal practices or philosophy or approach to storytelling and filmmaking?
I think that the collaboration one is a big one. And I feel like that is like a huge one that I take with me through my career of collaborating, but then also, Also just like confidence. I feel like it's one of those things where it's like having the confidence to just be like, this is what I want. And there's no value judgment in this moment of whether or not it's right or wrong. Like, this is just what we're going to do today and what I would like to see happen. So I just think that she's great in that way. And I just think she's also just like something to learn of just like, this is a business that whether you're a director or producer or DP, whatever you do, there's always going to be some level of somebody second guessing you, whether or not they work for you or they're the person that hired you, and just really going into things. And just, of course, I'm somebody who has self-doubt. I'd be kind of afraid of anybody who doesn't have self-doubt. I definitely have that and I grapple with it. But it's one of those things where it's like, even if I have the self-doubt about it, being able to project like, okay, this might... What? Kira, this is some crazy idea that you've got for how to handle this scene, but you're going for it. So let's just keep going. And there's this idea of like, even when I have my own self-doubt about it, like just having myself keep going, because I feel like that is where this fun part of the art that we do happens. Like, I hate it, but I love it. The feeling uncomfortable. And really like going through a job or knowing through something, I'm just like, oh my God, I don't know if this is right. I don't know if this is working. But I feel like that's where most of my best stuff happens. Like, I feel like when there's so many projects and so many jobs, I can look back and be like, oh, that was serious Kira comfort zone. Or that was like, there was something there of just like, there was fear, but not enough fear to push me into let's really try something. If I'm going to be afraid, I feel like we have like, I don't know, with this job, it's like there's always some level of like fear. Am I going to get fired? Fear, are my peers going to like this? Fear, like, like all these other things, but like that's going to exist no matter what. And so I feel like there's this world where if I push myself just past that is when I start really getting into the fun stuff. And it's not like, I feel like there's so much money involved in even like a small project. There's so much money involved and so many other opinions and so many other people that it's easy to be like, well, let me just go safe. I'm going to play this one safe. But the safe jobs are never the fulfilling ones. And I feel like for me, like at this point where I'm just like, I can't be safe anymore. I feel like it's one of those things where it's like we just kind of have to keep pushing ourselves as an artist and pushing ourselves in a way that's like how to further my storytelling techniques, but then also just like further the world's storytelling techniques in a way. And I feel like Ava's is just a really good example of like constantly pushing herself and pushing her crew and pushing towards something different and something out of the comfort zone. And I keep bringing this up. This movie I just wrapped was so outside of my comfort zone, but I had to like, when we wrapped, I had to take a week off to myself and just come back to myself. But I really do feel like it was a place where a lot of newness happened. And I feel like that's something that it has the potential to be such a comfortable industry, which is hard to say now because we've had a really uncomfortable 4 years as far as like just people's livelihoods in general, which I think adds another layer of fear. But I do love just constantly pushing myself, because otherwise I feel like there's a way, I've seen it happen to crew, I've seen it happen to everybody, where you just get to a point where it's like, this is comfy, or I got to pay for my kids' school or the car or something. And it's just like, let's stay in safe. But I feel like safe is scary. I think safe is scarier than doing the thing that scares you.
So, Kira, I think it was so inspiring to just hear you talk about how sometimes leading into that discomfort can be the best work that we're able to make. And I think that also hearing you describe those levels of fear, those layers of fear that we all have with our work and with this industry, it makes me think about this constant balance that I think we all have to go through of like trying to balance our work and our life with our work and trying to find that balance. And I heard you talk previously about how maybe there is no such thing as work-life balance, which I thought was such a refreshing thing to hear. Yeah. And how your perspective was that you don't turn off being a mother when you walk on the set, and you don't turn off being a DP when you walk into your house. And I just found that really interesting and inspiring and sort of a refreshing perspective. And yeah, I was curious to just kind of hear you talk about like embracing all aspects of one's life and work, and not putting pressure on yourself to feel like you're maybe failing at home when you're working or failing at work when you're at home?
I do think that like the whole work-life balance thing is such a farce and such a I don't know, it's like a t-shirt. You know, my daughter's almost 12 now, which is mind-boggling. But B, it's one of those things where I remember I still get such, you know, when I'm away, I feel like get the guilt, the whole thing. I try to FaceTime all the time. I come like in prep, like I come home on every weekend. Like it's just trying to make myself home and available, which is not something I'm proposing changing. I think that's just part of like how we end up doing it. But I do think a lot in the beginning, I made myself wrong about it. And I was very much about like, this is wrong. Like, this is not how you raise a kid, this whole thing. And it was something Mandy Walker, I remember I had this conversation with her about this. And she was just like, you know, she was saying how, because, you know, Mandy has her daughter. And basically what she was saying was that I'm the one making it weird. I'm the one making it very much like there's something wrong here. Because for my daughter, it's like, that's all she's ever known. Like, she doesn't know anything different except that, you know, mommy goes away on this job and is doing something and then she'll be back and she's always back. And I feel like so much of it came from me of trying to make this situation like apologizing, like, I'm so sorry, I missed this and all this stuff. And when I do miss things, I genuinely am sorry. But now I kind of frame it in this world of like, this is our weird little family. And this is what, you know, she will end up remembering as like, you know, this is what mom did. And I do think that like, it's one of those things, for example, like when I went away for this job and then also like I was away for a portion of last year, and my husband and my daughter have created the most beautiful bedtime routine, like this kind of like changed, and they still have this thing of like, he puts her to bed and there's this like, they have this whole like story time that they do together. And I've never felt more of like an outsider within the family because there was no place for me in that routine. But, and not that there's no place, but it is definitely their thing and it's beautiful. And I find myself thinking of like, how lucky am I and how lucky is she that she has a dad who like they've created this beautiful time together. How lucky am I that I have a partner who is like has gone full into this dad mode, who's kept the daughter alive, kept the dogs alive. One plant died, which is probably the most that you can ask for. But like they have a beautiful thing. And then, you know, Bowie and I have our own beautiful moments. And I just think it's like one of those things where it's, I don't know. She told me the other day that like, I remember I had to take her to Panavision early on for this camera test this year. And I had to stand in, but Bowie had jobs. Like she was off from school one day and like she was camera operating and she got off, she changed the level of a light and then she had to go stand in the mid-ground of something for focusing. And we did it like for every lens. So we had this whole thing mapped out. And at the end of the day, she was like, I think I could be a DP. And my heart just like, I tried to be cool. I was like driving. That was like such an affirmation of like whether or not she's a DP, like whatever she wants to do. But in that moment that she kind of found something nice about it, I felt like there was this thing of like, okay, maybe it's all fine. Like, you know, she's going to be okay. And I feel like there's these things of like so much pressure. I think that women put on themselves in general, just like so much unnecessary pressure that we put on. And then this myth of like work-life balance is like even more pressure. It's like, it's not always okay. It's not like, it's not some cheery balance that I pick out, but there are times when it's like, it's fine that it's not okay. You know what I mean? I feel like it's one of those things where the more we acknowledge like, wow, this is really difficult. And you know, this is not how I ended up dreaming about motherhood, but this is perfect for what we end up doing. You know what I mean? And I don't know, I feel like there's all this pressure, and I talk to younger DPs and they're like, how do I know when I have a family and all this stuff? And it's just like, I don't think DP or not, nobody's really ever ready to have a family. It's not like a good time, it seems like, for any of it. But I just think we have to be a little bit more kind to ourselves of like, you'll figure it out and your family will figure it out. And I think that the great thing is that my daughter knows that like when she calls, I pick up, like, no matter what the setup is or whatever, like, you know, she knows that she can reach me, and that's, you know, that's something.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so refreshing to hear, and it's inspiring. I think it is a daunting idea to have a normal life in the industry we work in, and it's very inspiring to see someone like you having had so much success and being able to be honest about what it looks like. It's cool that you brought up Mandy Walker too, because we interviewed her and we asked her about her daughter, and she said, if I remember correctly, I think she said something like, even when she got old enough, she's like, she would come on shoots with me and she led this crazy adventurous life, and like, it's all just about how you frame it, you know? And I remember thinking that was so cool, that was Mandy's approach, was just how to frame it.
She definitely gave me, in saying that, she gave me so much relief of just like, stop making it weird. It's right what I needed to hear.
So cool.
Yeah.
So Kara, as we kind of like wrap up, this has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you for going there with us, and everything you've said has been very, very inspiring. Speaking of inspiration, we you know, I heard you mention that you've been inspired by cinematographers like Gordon Willis and Harris Savitas and Bradford Young, and I'd just love to hear you talk about why their approach to storytelling inspires you as a cinematographer.
I think for me, Gordon Willis is always somebody. So when I first decided to go to film school, it wasn't because I certainly had no clue what a DP was. I didn't know who Gordon Willis was. I didn't know any of it. I just kind of loved taking stills, and I loved movies, right? And I would watch movies and TV. I mean, I was like, I just watched a lot of television and movies when I was younger. And I remember, and this is me aging myself, like I was in high school when Godfather 3 came out. And I remember I went to see it with my mom. And granted, of the Godfathers, we can probably say it's certainly not the best Godfather. But it did give me like, I was like, oh, what's this weird, like, what is this about? And I remember I went back through and started watching The Godfathers, and Godfather 1, Godfather 2, and I just got so into it. Like really just, and I couldn't tell you why. Again, like I didn't really know what a cinematographer did until film school. Like I was, you know, in college, right? But there was something about it that I just couldn't name. I couldn't like think. I was like, I want to do that. Like there was something about it. And then I was kind of like, once I got into school and really started studying more films, and then really learned who Gordon Willis was and like his other works, I was just like, there was something about his work and the fact that he was able to do things like The Godfather and then do things like comedies. And so it's one of those things where I feel like his work, there was something about it where it was just like always consistently beautiful, or as beautiful as it needed to be for the story. But like, so there was something about it where you kind of look at his images that I just found myself like, I just loved his work, right? And then I got into Harris of just like, I was in New York while he was still working there. I never got to work with him or meet him, which I was really kind of bummed about, but knew plenty of people who had worked with him. And just his style, again, was somebody who was able to be super subtle, yet so distinctive. You know what I mean? I feel like there's just this world where as DPs, it's so easy to be attracted to the flash. It's so easy to be like, wow, that looks amazing. I want to do that. Or I want to do all these things. But really, when you look at it like in true service to a story, it's so different. There's like a subtlety to an image that can be very much in your face, but it's not because the image is just there to be a cool image. It's like really in service in some way. So yeah, and I feel like there's this thing with Harris and with Gordon Willis's work and with Bradford too. Brad is like one of those things where you look at this image where you think of like, in theory, it looks like so natural, like nothing really went into this but when you look at it, you're just like, oh shit, this is like, it's work to make images look like they're no work, you know? And I feel like that's kind of our saying, especially like, you know, with coming from documentary and things like that. It's just like trying to figure out a way. I rarely try to walk into a space and recreate it of just like, wouldn't it be like all this stuff and all this cool things. And I really do, I think, end up coming back to, I do like a single source sensibility. And not to say I have hard and fast rules, I don't really, but I do like the idea of trying to strip things down a little bit. And I feel like the three of them are really great at that. And there's so many other DPs that I think are just incredible and so good at their craft. And just like all the time you look and you're like, oh my God, how do you ever do that? And I feel like it's even easier now for us to fall into this trap of comparison because of social media and all this stuff, when really I think the most that we ever really have to worry about is, or what I try to worry about is, am I telling the story? And I feel like once you get past all the other things, whether it's flash or all this stuff, that maybe it is a story that needs a flashy look, and that's when then you're telling that story. But if that's the only thing you end up having to depend on, then suddenly you're just like, when it's a much more quiet story, then you're kind of like, it's probably a little, I don't know, more difficult. I just love the idea of trying to, I think right now I'm at a point where it's just like, how much can I just strip away and just see where that ends up leading me? So.
What do you mean by strip away?
You know, as a cinematographer, there's so many decisions. Like, there's just so many decisions to make before you even get on set. Camera, lens, filters, like all this stuff, how it's going to look. And then once you're on set, there's even more crazy decisions about like, okay, where's the light going to go? Where's the thing going to go? And all this stuff. The LUTs, like I'm such a one LUT DP. I have friends who I've seen, like they've like the indoor LUT, outdoor LUT, interior day LUT, like night LUT and all that stuff. My brain just can't handle it all. So it's like I have one LUT that I go with. I have one camera. I mean, like I really like some variety of an Alexa is the only camera I can really brain at this point. And then maybe I'll change my lenses. I'll like even filters at this point. I'm kind of stripping away a little bit if the lens can do all the work. So I really just try to be more bare bones mentally, I think is kind of the thing where, you know, like this, again, like this film I just finished, which is fresh in my head. We did like all this different color work and there was all these different, like it was very wonderfully stylized, which was really fun. But even in that, I found myself just stripping away. Like I feel like for me, I do this thing of like, you know, when I get on set, my gaffer, I keep up, they have all the notes from the scout, all the notes of what we've talked about. And usually at that point, I find myself, yes, you add stuff. You're like, okay, let's try this. But I also just try to sit with myself. There's a lot of things that you have to work on and like figure out in a very timely manner. You know, it's a very like this game that you play with a clock, right? And so I end up trying to always save a little bit of time where I'm like, okay, is there anything I can take away? Is there anything I can subtract? After this is this image that I like, maybe I just sat here and added shit I didn't need to for the last like 5 minutes. Is there anything I can take away? And I feel like that's sort of where, and it's also just a great meditative place for me that I try to force myself to go, like just sit, look at it. The AD might be right there, like whatever. But is there anything that I can strip away to bring this back if I've over-engineered anything? So I think that's the kind of like the stripping away of just trying to, I guess, just trying not to get cute. Like all the time. Of just like, how can I bring this down to its essence?
I love that. Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
All right, so Ava, we like to ask our guests a little bit about sort of their experience with mentorship or anything that they want to share about role models or people who have helped them along the way and maybe examples of how they've provided those opportunities to people coming up. I think that a big part of the reason that we do the show is to help educate others in order to educate ourselves. And I think that I'd love to just hear you talk about anything along your journey that has helped you and maybe any examples of ways that you like to pass that information on.
Yeah, I feel like I've had so many mentors and help in my career that's been kind of amazing. And I feel like I got to a point where, I don't know, I wasn't always the best about asking for help. I wasn't always the best about asking for advice. And I will say it seems like it's strange. I feel like the older I get, the more comfortable I am in like asking for help or like thinking like, how would you handle this? Or how would you, whether it's a technical thing or whether or not it's like a life thing. I feel like the more community that we end up establishing, the better and the easier it is to ask for help. And I think for me, it's like coming out of like working in TV, one of the best things that I ended up getting was like, when we're alternating DPs who became friends, and like people like Magdalena Gorka was like such a good friend of mine. It's such a good sounding block that we met we met not through alternating, but then we alternated and started working together. But I feel like the more friends that you get that you're able to really bounce ideas off of, the better. And then for me, for mentoring, I just feel like it's one of those things where I sometimes don't realize that maybe I'm not as attuned to, wow, maybe I do have things that somebody would like to know, or like, information, or what can I share? And like, I have a couple mentees now from the ASC, and like the questions that I get are always so fun in a way that they make you think about things. And it's so interesting to hear somebody else's entry point into things. And I think that people really don't know how much people like to share, like it is something where like it's a question about like how you got here or why you got here or why some things are important to you. Like people like to discuss it. And for me, like I've had so many, like, I remember when I first met Johnny Simmons, I thought that like, wow, he's my mentor. That's just like, meanwhile, I was talking to somebody else about it. They're like, you mean Uncle Johnny? I'm like, what do you mean Uncle Johnny? It's like, because he's everybody's mentor. Johnny is just so giving and so honest with his feedback and calls me to be a better mentor to others, because I see how much he invests, not only in me, but like, I feel like half of LA. I just think that people like that who are just so giving with their time and everything, it calls upon you to do more. And so I think that with working in film and filmmaking in general, I think sometimes it can be so shrouded and people get very secretive, like, oh, that's my recipe, or all this stuff, where it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's so much more information and we can be so much better about it when we share it. And I do think that there is a place for any of those conversations. Like I said, I learned so much from people who are still operating and like trying to DP, or people who are just starting to DP and like trying to take the next move. And it's just like, how can we help each other in an industry where sometimes helping isn't the first impulse? I think a lot of times in this industry, and hopefully it's changing, a lot of it is like protecting. This thing of like, I've got mine and I've got to keep it. It's just like, no, we actually all have. I do really think that as DPs, so much of the jobs that I get and the things that I do, yes, your credits are part of it. Yes, your reel is part of it. But like how you come across in a meeting is a whole other thing, or how you sit and relate to a director is like a whole other thing. It's very personal. And I feel like there's times where we kind of forget that all this stuff is relationship based. And I feel like the more we are about figuring out those relationships and where we fall within them, the better. So yeah, I think mentoring I've been very lucky to have some really great mentors in my life. And then I hope that I can share that same thing.
Wow. Yeah, it's so beautifully said. I think it's such a great point that everyone has a different entry point, and how knowledge sharing can be so powerful. I feel like it can really change people's paths. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on today and for talking to us. This is unbelievably amazing, and I'm feeling very inspired, and thank you.
Thank you both. I really thank you for making this as easy as you did. So yeah, it was a good convo.
This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Ava Benjamin Shore, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave and edited by Corey Abel. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the salon community for supporting our efforts with this show. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Able Cine for their continued support. If you're unfamiliar with their offerings, Able Cine provides services such as equipment rentals, sales, maintenance, training, and much more. Additionally, they host complimentary events at their various locations. For more details, please visit ablecine.com. If you enjoyed listening to the show, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.